please take just a second before the story starts. Hit the like button and please tell me where you're watching from in the comment. Let's see which country shows the most support. The Great Hall of Valethorn Keep had been built to last 1,000 years. Its stone walls were 3 feet thick, carved from the black granite quarried out of the Ashenmoor Mountains. Its ceiling soared 40 feet above the mosaic floor, hung with iron chandeliers that burned 100 candles each. Every corner of it was a monument to power, to legacy, to the unbreakable rule of the Valethorn Pack, the oldest, fiercest, most feared wolf bloodline in the Northern Territories. Marina had always found it cold. Not the temperature. The fireplaces in Valethorn Keep burned day and night, fed by servants who moved like shadows and never made eye contact with the Luna. No, it was the kind of cold that lived in the bones of a place. The kind that came from centuries of cruelty dressed up in fine stone and candlelight. She had been Luna here for 3 years, and for 3 years she had tried to make it warm. Tonight she wore a deep green gown that brushed the floor. Her dark hair, the color of wet earth after rain, was pinned at the back of her neck in the way Darach liked. Simple, elegant, controlled. She had learned very quickly in this marriage that Darach Valethorn had opinions about everything, and that keeping the peace was easier than feeding the fire. She was walking back from the kitchens. She had gone herself, something that still made the kitchen staff go stiff with surprise, to check that the venison stew for tomorrow's Elder Council meeting was properly seasoned. She liked to know things firsthand. She liked to be useful in ways that went beyond standing decoratively at her husband's side. The corridor that connected the East Wing kitchens to the main staircase passed directly beside the Lord's private study. A narrow hall, lit by 2 iron wall sconces that always needed fresh oil. The door was old oak, thick and reinforced, and in all her 3 years here, Marina had never heard a sound through it. Tonight she heard laughter. It was not the polite, measured laughter of a pack lord entertaining allies. It was loose, unguarded, the laughter of a man who believed himself entirely alone with his own thoughts. She almost kept walking. Almost. "You should have seen her face at the winter solstice gathering," said the voice behind the door. Darach's voice. She would know it anywhere. Low and smooth, the kind of voice that always sounded like it was holding something back. Standing there in that gold gown, smiling at everyone, genuinely believing she belongs among us. It is almost sad. Marina stopped. Her right hand found the wall. A second voice responded. Friedrich, she thought, Darach's eldest cousin, a wiry, sharp-faced man who had never once looked at her with anything except cold calculation. She is convincing, I'll grant her that. The pack elders speak well of her. That is the point, Darach said, and there was the sound of liquid being poured, wine or something stronger. That is the entire point, Friedrich. She is exactly what she looks like. Quiet, gracious, grateful. A base-born girl who cannot believe her luck at being chosen by an alpha king. She plays the Luna beautifully because she does not know she is only playing a part. The stone wall was very cold under Marina's palm. And you, Friedrich asked, 3 years, Darach, has she ever suspected? Suspected what? That I chose her because she is forgettable? A pause, the sound of a glass being set down. She is safe, Friedrich. She does not threaten me. She does not challenge me. She does not know enough about our true politics to be dangerous. The elders wanted their Luna, a soft, gentle face to balance my rule. She is that face, nothing more. And Rowena. A beat of silence. Then very quietly, a sound Marina had never heard from her husband before. Tenderness. Rowena is a different matter entirely, Darach said, and the shift in his voice was so complete it was like listening to a different man. Warm, real, alive. Rowena understands what I am. She does not flinch from it. She does not try to soften me or change me or fill my home with warmth I never asked for. She is the only woman I have ever wanted in this life. Does she know about? She knows everything, Darach said. And then, with a lightness that turned Marina's blood to ice, he laughed again. I have never loved my wife. Not for a single moment in 3 years. I married a useful, pretty, harmless girl to keep the elders satisfied. That is all she has ever been." The floor of the corridor seemed to tilt. Marina pressed both palms flat against the wall and breathed through her nose. One breath, then another. Her wolf, that deep, ancient part of her that lived below conscious thought, let out a sound that was not quite a whimper and not quite a growl. Something in between. The sound a creature makes when it has been struck somewhere it did not know it was vulnerable. She had known, somewhere in the quiet hours of this marriage, that things were not right. She had known from the first winter, when Darach would go 3 and 4 nights without coming to their shared rooms, and offer no explanation, and she had not asked for one. She had known from the way he looked at her in public, always appropriate, always careful, never warm. She had known from the faint, foreign scent she had once caught on the collar of his riding coat and told herself she imagined. She had convinced herself, slowly and thoroughly, that this was simply what noble wolf marriages looked like. That warmth would come later, that she was patient and he was busy and love was a thing that grew quietly, like roots under frozen ground. She had been lying to herself for 3 years. One hand moved, instinctively, to her abdomen. 8 weeks. She was 8 weeks along. She had confirmed it 4 days ago with the pack healer in secret because she wanted to be certain before she told Darach. She had been planning the moment, imagining his face. Hopping, genuinely, stupidly hopping, that the news of a child might shift something between them, might crack open whatever wall he had built and let something real come through. I have never loved my wife, not for a single moment in 3 years. Marina pulled her hand away from her stomach. She straightened. She smoothed the front of her green gown with both hands, the way she had learned to smooth everything in this house. Quietly, automatically, leaving no sign of what lay underneath. Then she turned and walked away from the door. Her footsteps made no sound on the stone. She had learned that too. In Valethorn Keep, silence was survival. But inside her chest, the mate bond, that sacred thread the moon goddess was said to weave between 2 souls, was not snapping cleanly. It was doing something worse. It was fraying. Slowly. Strand by agonizing strand. Each one pulling free with a small, private shock of pain that radiated from the center of her ribs outward. By the time she reached the foot of the main staircase, she understood something with a cold, crystalline certainty that had no grief left in it. Only clarity. She was not going to tell him about the child. She was never going to tell him anything again. She climbed the stairs slowly, her hand trailing the iron banister. A servant passed her on the landing and dropped into a respectful bow. Marina gave the woman a small, real smile, because it cost her nothing, and she had always believed that kindness to those beneath you was the truest measure of a person, and continued to her rooms. The Luna's chambers were on the 3rd floor. They were beautiful, tapestries from the southern coasts, a wide hearth that burned birchwood and smelled of something almost like pine, a window seat that overlooked the forest. She had made this room hers slowly over 3 years, adding small things, a stack of books from the market, a clay pot of dried herbs from the kitchen garden, a drawing her young niece had made and sent from home. She sat down at the edge of her bed and looked at the room. She looked at it the way you look at a place you are saying goodbye to. Then she stood, walked to the carved oak chest at the foot of the bed, and lifted the lid. She had told herself the contents of this chest were a precaution. A habit from her childhood. She had grown up in a family with very little, and very little had taught her to always keep one foot pointed toward the door. Inside the chest, wrapped in an old linen cloth, was a leather satchel. Inside the satchel was everything she had quietly gathered over 3 years without knowing quite why. 160 gold coins she had saved from her personal allowance, spending only what she needed and hoarding the rest. A plain wool cloak with no markings. 2 changes of clothes, simple, dark, unremarkable. A small glass vial of dried thorn moss, which, when crushed and rubbed into the skin, would confuse and blunt the scent tracking of any wolf trying to follow her trail. And a folded letter, written in her own hand and addressed to no one, that she had drafted one sleepless night 6 months ago and never sent. She unfolded the letter now. Read it. Set it in the fire. She did not need it anymore. There was nothing left to explain. She changed out of the green gown, Darach's preferred color, Darach's preferred style, Darach's preferred wife, and put on the plain dark clothes. She pulled the wool cloak over her shoulders. She crushed the thorn moss between her fingers, breathing through the sharp, bitter sting, and pressed her fingers to the pulse points at her wrists and throat and behind her ears. The burning sensation made her eyes water. Her wolf protested loudly, instinctively resisting anything that dulled her senses. Hush, she told the wolf, we need this, trust me. She picked up the satchel. She touched her stomach once, not with hope this time, but with a fierce, clean sense of purpose that felt more like armor than grief. You will never know his coldness, she told the child she was carrying. I promise you that. The third floor had a servant's passage, a narrow stair built into the east wall for the household staff to move between floors without disturbing the family. Marina knew every inch of it. She had made it her business from her first week in this house to learn the name, face, and daily routine of every person who worked here. Darach had called it a charming eccentricity. The truth was simpler. She had always understood that in a house where she had no real power, information was the only currency that mattered. She went down the servants' stair, through the ground floor laundry room, out through the narrow door at the side of the building that opened onto the service courtyard. The night was moonless. Heavy clouds rolled in from the north, thick with the smell of coming rain. Good. She crossed the service courtyard, staying low and close to the stone wall, timing her movement past the guard post at the corner when the sentry turned away on his rotation. Her heart was very loud in her own ears. Her hands were completely steady. She reached the postern gate, the small, old door cut into the outer wall that the pack had used for 200 years to let tradesmen in and out without opening the main gates. It was locked with a heavy iron bolt from the inside. She pulled the bolt back. It groaned once, a sound that seemed to swallow the whole dark courtyard. She froze, counted to 20, nothing moved. She pushed the door open, stepped through, and pulled it shut behind her. The forest received her immediately, dark, dense, alive with the small sounds of night creatures. The path she was looking for was not a real path. It was a deer trail she had walked a dozen times in daylight, enough to know it by memory. It curved northwest, away from the main road, away from the village, away from every place anyone who knew her would think to look. She walked. Above her, the first drops of rain began to fall. Within minutes it was a downpour, cold and heavy and relentless, washing her footprints from the mud and filling the forest with a roar of white noise that swallowed every other sound. Behind her, in the warm golden windows of Valethorn Keep, her husband was still laughing. She did not look back. Darach Valethorn had not earned his title by being careless. He had taken the Alpha King's seat at 24 after a succession war that had lasted 2 years and left 3 of his rivals dead and 2 more exiled to the outer territories. He had rebuilt the Valethorn Pack's commercial holdings, expanded their territorial boundaries, and negotiated a treaty with the Ironmere Pack that had held unbroken for 6 years. He was respected, feared, more often by every wolf lord in the northern territories. He was also deeply, efficiently, privately in love with a woman who was not his wife. Rowena Asheville, the third daughter of the Asheville Pack in the south, dark-eyed, wry, ferociously intelligent, with a talent for pack politics that matched Darach's own and a complete lack of any interest in the soft domestic graces the elder council valued in a Luna. She was not soft. She was not gentle. She saw him clearly, all of it, the ambition and the ruthlessness and the particular brand of loneliness that came from being the most powerful man in the room, and she stayed anyway. He had married Marina because Rowena would never have satisfied the elders. Too sharp, they said, too northern, too unconventional. The Valethorn Alpha needed a Luna who reflected well on the pack. Marina had reflected beautifully. She always did. He woke on the morning after his conversation with Friederich, to an unusual quality of silence. The bedroom was cold. The fire had burned down to embers, and no servant had come to rebuild it, which meant it was not yet the 6th hour and the household was still in its pre-dawn quiet. This was normal. What was not normal was the smell of the room, or rather the absence of it. Marina had a scent the way most people had a heartbeat, constant, ambient, something you only noticed when it was gone. Rain-washed linen and something faintly green, like new growth, like the first week of spring when the earth opens up and breathes again. It was in the bedding, in the air of the room, in the particular warmth that radiated from her side of the bed. He reached across without opening his eyes. Cold sheets. He opened his eyes. He sat up, looked at the room. Everything looked the same, the tapestries, the furniture, the dying fire, the window with its dark pre-dawn sky. But no Marina. He was not initially alarmed. She sometimes rose early. She sometimes went to the kitchens or the library, or he had discovered this once by accident, simply sat in the window seat of her room with a book and a cup of tea and watched the sky go light. She was a person of small, private rituals that she never explained, and he had never asked about. He got up, pulled on his robe, walked to the connecting door between their chambers and knocked once briefly. Silence. He pushed it open. The room was perfectly tidy, which was wrong because Marina's room was never perfectly tidy. She was not a messy person, but she was a lived-in one, with books left open on surfaces and small personal objects placed with the comfortable carelessness of someone who felt at home in her own space. Every surface was clear. He crossed to the wardrobe, opened it. Her formal gowns hung in neat rows, the expensive ones, the ones that were as much costume as clothing. But the everyday dresses were gone. The plain boots that sat at the bottom. The worn linen shirts she had brought from her family home and refused to replace because she liked the weight of them. His eyes moved to the small oak chest at the foot of the bed. Open, empty. He stood very still in the center of her room. His wolf, usually a dormant and well-managed thing in his daily life, suddenly lurched sideways inside his chest like a creature that has just sensed something falling. He reached inward toward the mate bond. Nothing. Not silence. Wolves understood silence. What he found was something he had no category for, an absence that was not peaceful, a place where something had been and wasn't anymore, like pressing your tongue to the gap left by a pulled tooth over and over, unable to stop probing the thing that hurt. He crossed to the dressing table. No jewelry left behind. She had taken her simple things, the plain pieces she actually wore, not the formal veil-thorn pieces that had been gifts from the elder council, and which he now realized had probably never felt like hers. On the dressing table, in the center of the cleared surface, sat a single object. A small, folded piece of paper. He picked it up with hands that were, to his own considerable surprise, not entirely steady. He unfolded it. It was a receipt from the pack healer, dated 4 days ago, a brief notation in the healer's careful handwriting. Luna confirmed 8 weeks, all signs healthy and strong. Below the healer's notation, in Marina's own handwriting, neat, precise, unhurried, the handwriting of a woman who had thought carefully before she put the pen to paper. His name, if he is born under a summer moon, is yours to choose. That is the only thing I leave to you. Darach read it twice. Then he sat down on the edge of her bed, her empty, cold, carefully made bed, and stayed very still for a long time. 8 weeks. She was 8 weeks pregnant, and she had known for 4 days, and she had not told him. And now she was gone in the night, without a word to a single person in the household. With nothing but her plainest clothes and whatever she had been quietly saving, and she had left him a healer's receipt and a sentence about names. He pressed his knuckles against his mouth. The thing moving in his chest now was not the mate bond. The mate bond was still that terrible blank absence. What was moving was something older, something that lived below thought and reason and the carefully managed machinery of who he had decided to be. Grief, possibly, or the beginning of understanding what grief meant. He stood up. His face, by the time he reached the door to the corridor, was fully composed. Whatever had moved across it in those few minutes in her room, whatever real and unguarded thing had surfaced in the cold and the silence, was gone. The Alpha King was back, controlled, purposeful, already running calculations. He pulled the cord that summoned his head of household. Then he dressed methodically while he waited. When Farron, a compact, steady man of middle years who had served Valethorn Keep for 20 of them, appeared at the door, Darach was already at his desk. "The Luna left in the night," Darach said. Not looking up from the map he was already unrolling. His voice was level. It was the voice he used when he was managing something he had not yet decided how to feel. "Pull the perimeter guards. I want a report on every departure from the keep in the last 8 hours. Every gate, every postern, every gap in the wall you know about, and every one you don't." Farron didn't blink. "Yes, Alpha." Quietly, Darach added. The word landed with its full weight. Not a word to the Elder Council, not to Lord Frederick, not to anyone outside this house. The Luna is visiting her family in the east. That is the story. Understood. Farron hesitated at the door, a rare thing. "Alpha, the head tracker, Orin, should I?" "Yes, send Orin to me, now." When Farron left, Darach sat back in his chair and looked at the healer's receipt on his desk. "His name, if he is born under a summer moon, is yours to choose." She had been planning to tell him. He understood that now. She had been building toward a moment, some private imagined scene of announcement, and somewhere in those 4 days between the healer's appointment and last night, something had changed her mind so completely, and so finally that she had packed a bag, crushed thorn moss into her skin. He had caught the faint, bitter residue of it in her room. It explained the absence of her scent, and walked out into a rainstorm rather than remain in this house one more hour. He did not have to think very hard about what she might have heard. The study, the conversation with Frederick, the fire and the wine, and his own unguarded voice, rolling out through 3 feet of old oak as though the stone itself had wanted her to hear it. He picked up the healer's receipt and held it. "I have never loved my wife, not for a single moment in 3 years." He had meant it when he said it. That was the thing that sat in the room with him now and refused to be managed or filed away or converted into something more comfortable. He had meant every word of it, and he had said it with laughter in his voice, and his pregnant wife had been standing on the other side of the door. Orin arrived 20 minutes later. He was tall and lean, with Tracker's eyes pale and very still, taking in everything without appearing to look at anything. He had tracked rogue wolves across 200 miles of northern forest. He was the best in the territory, and he knew it, in the way truly skilled people knew things, quietly, without needing to say so. "She used thorn moss," Darach told him. "A heavy application. The rain started around midnight. She had several hours head start." Orin absorbed this with no visible reaction. "Which direction did she want you to think she went?" "An interesting question, the right question." "She's too careful to go anywhere obvious," Darach said. "She wouldn't take the eastern road toward her family. She knows we'd check there first." He paused. "She's been here 3 years. She's been paying attention." Orin nodded slowly. "Then we start from what she knows and work backward to what she'd choose." He looked at the map on the desk. "May I?" Darach stepped aside. Orin leaned over the map, his tracker's stillness becoming something focused and methodical. Outside the window, the rain had stopped. The morning was gray and cold and very quiet. Somewhere out in that gray morning, Darach's wife was walking, carrying his child, moving further away with every minute that passed. He looked at the map and felt something he did not have a clean name for. Not guilt, exactly. He was not, by nature, a man who carried guilt easily, but something adjacent to it, something that came from the specific and unfamiliar experience of being outmaneuvered by a person he had never once taken seriously. She had been paying attention, all right. The question was what she had seen. The village of Darachvast sat at the end of a river valley, so deeply tucked between two mountain ridges that the sun only reached the main street for about 4 hours a day, even in summer. The people of Darachvast were, accordingly, a people accustomed to existing in partial shadow. They were self-sufficient, close-mouthed with outsiders, and possessed of a deep collective instinct for minding their own business that was less a cultural choice and more a survival strategy. Darachvast sat on the boundary between 3 different pack territories. The people who lived there had learned generations ago that the less any wolf lord knew about their comings and goings, the better. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of place a woman with no name who was running from a wolf lord might successfully disappear into. Marina arrived on the morning of the 3rd day. She had walked most of the first night, cutting through forest rather than following roads, and spent the 2nd day sleeping in the hayloft of an abandoned barn 4 miles outside a small farming settlement. She had eaten her way through the dried food she had packed and drunk from streams. Her boots were caked in mud. She was deeply, bone-achingly tired in the way that came not just from physical exertion, but from the particular exhaustion of leaving a life behind. Her wolf, interestingly, was calm. Not happy, wolves were social creatures, and the severing of a pack bond, even one as hollow as hers had been, left a ghost pain in its wake. But calm in the way a creature is calm when it knows, instinctively, that it is finally moving in the right direction. The pregnancy made itself known every morning now, a deep, rolling nausea that she was learning to manage with small sips of water and very slow movement. Her sense of smell was already sharpening beyond its usual keenness, which was both useful for tracking potential threats and deeply inconvenient when she had to walk through a village that smelled strongly of fish and wood smoke. The inn at Darachvast was called the Graymore Rest. It was the kind of establishment where the sign above the door had weathered to the point of illegibility, and nobody had bothered to repaint it, because everyone who needed to know what it was already knew. The woman behind the bar when Marina pushed open the door at mid-morning was broad-shouldered and gray-haired, with the flat, assessing eyes of someone who had spent 40 years watching strangers walk through that door and developing an extremely accurate sense of which ones were trouble. Her name, Marina would eventually learn, was Bryn, and she smelled human, thank the moon, because the scent of another wolf right now would have meant a different calculation entirely. She was sharp enough to see most of what mattered in about 10 seconds of looking. "Room?" she asked. "Please," Marina said. She had her hood up and her voice was steady. "Longer term, if that's possible. I'm not sure how long I'll need." "Work?" Bryn asked, the word blunt and entirely without judgment. "Whatever you have," Marina said. "I'm not particular. I'm a decent cook. I can clean. I can manage books if you need someone with numbers." Bryn looked at her, not at her cloak or her boots or the quality of the bag on her shoulder, but at her face, directly, the way people look when they're trying to read something they can't quite make out. "You running from something?" Bryn asked. Marina considered lying, decided, with a particular clarity that had settled over her since she left the keep, that a lie here would only create future complications. "Yes," she said. "Will it follow you here and make trouble for my house?" "I will do everything in my power to ensure it doesn't," Marina said. And then, because she believed in offering people the truth when she asked them to take a risk, "But I cannot promise it won't try." Bryn was quiet for a moment. Then she reached under the bar and produced a key. "Rooms at the top, chambers small, shared bath down the hall." She set the key on the bar. "You'll help in the kitchen from the 5th hour to the 10th and keep the common room clean from the 10th to the 2nd. Your meals are included. Coin on top of that is modest but fair." "It's more than fair," Marina said. She meant it completely. "What's your name?" Bryn asked. She had prepared for this question. She had spent 2 days walking through the dark thinking about exactly this question. "Wren," she said, the name of a small, plain, unremarkable bird, a bird that was almost invisible when it stayed still. the kind of creature that survived by being overlooked. Bryn repeated as though testing the shape of it. All right, go get some sleep. You look like the road nearly finished you. Wren picked up the key. She climbed the narrow staircase to the small room at the top of the inn. It had a single bed, a window the size of a dinner plate that looked out at a mossy stone wall, and a hook on the back of the door. Nothing else. She sat on the edge of the bed and breathed. No tapestries, no iron chandeliers, no servants moving like shadows around the edges of her carefully curated, utterly loveless life. No Darich. She pressed both hands against the small, barely there curve of her abdomen and felt, for the first time since that corridor outside the study, something other than grief and calculation. Something quiet and certain in hers. We're all right, she told the child. We're going to be all right. She was not certain this was true, but she believed it in the way you believe things when the alternative is not bearable, and sometimes that was enough to get you through the night. She lay down without taking off her boots. She was asleep before the room had finished settling around her. 2 weeks later, Wren was a fixture at the Graymore Rest. She had, in that time, learned that Bryn had run the inn for 30 years, had a son who worked the river barges and a daughter who had married into a farming family 2 valleys over, and held opinions about pack politics that she expressed exclusively through the volume and speed with which she chopped vegetables. She had learned that the village of Darichvast had its own rhythms and its own internal logic, and that the best way to become part of those rhythms was to be consistently useful, consistently quiet, and consistently interested in other people in a way that never required anything in return. This was not difficult for Marina. It was simply who she was. She had told no one she was pregnant yet. At 9 weeks it was barely visible and easily concealed under the loose work shirts Bryn had given her. But she had identified the village's healer, a wiry old man named Oswin Human, who kept a small practice above the apothecary, and made a careful, anonymous first visit on a market day when the village was busy enough that she was just another face in the crowd. Oswin had not asked her name. He had listened to her heartbeat, and then listened for the second one below it, and confirmed what she already knew, and told her she was healthy and the child was strong and to eat more iron-rich food and sleep on her left side. Then he had handed her a small bundle of herbs and told her to make a tea from them every morning, and charged her a price so modest it might have been a kindness on purpose. She liked Darichvast. She did not let herself like it too much. Because somewhere north of here, on the other side of 2 mountain ridges and 60 miles of forest, Darich Valethorn had almost certainly discovered she was gone. And Darich was not a man who left things unresolved. She knew that much about him, even from a marriage built on nothing. She needed to be ready to run again if she had to. But she also needed to rest. The child needed her to rest. And so she did both things at once. She settled, quietly and carefully, into the life of Wren the kitchen girl, and she kept her satchel packed and her boots by the door, and every morning when she woke she listened to the sounds of the village and measured whether anything in them had changed. So far nothing had. But she had not stopped listening. There was something Marina had not included in her account of herself when she sat on the edge of that inn bed and told the child they would be all right. A secret, the kind that had weight to it, the kind that pulled at the bottom of everything like a stone tied to a rope, and that she had been carrying alone for over a year. She had found it by accident. 14 months ago, in the deep winter, she had been in the Valethorn Keep archives. She had developed a habit of spending time in the archives, because it was one of the few places in the keep where no one expected anything of her. She had found a locked section in the deepest part of the archive. A room behind a room, accessible through a door she had only discovered because a junior archive clerk had left it ajar one afternoon, and she had seen, through the gap, the amber light of an oil lamp and the corner of a very old wooden chest. She had not gone in then. She had noted it and waited and gone back 3 weeks later at the 4th hour of the morning when the archive was empty, and found that the door, old, heavy, slightly warped in its frame, could be persuaded open with the right angle of pressure if you knew where to push. Inside was a small room, stone-walled and dry, lit by a lamp that someone maintained and refilled regularly. The chest contained documents. Some were very old, parchment and formal seal, the records of the Veilthorn Pack's oldest political dealings, but some were recent, disturbingly recent. She had read carefully. She had read everything. She had read it in parts, over 6 visits stretched across 4 months, each time leaving everything exactly as she found it. What she had found was this: the Veilthorn Pack's claim to the Alpha King seat, the claim that gave Darach his authority over every wolf lord in the Northern Territories, was built on a lie. Not a small lie, not the kind of political shading that any honest person would acknowledge was simply how power worked. A fundamental, document-level forgery. The ancient compact that established the Veilthorn bloodline as the supreme ruling line of the North was not what it appeared to be. There were 2 versions of it. The original, which she had found rolled and sealed in a wax cloth at the very bottom of the chest, established a council of 5 bloodlines with rotating authority and no single supreme line. And then there was the version that hung framed in the Great Hall of Veilthorn Keep, and that every wolf lord in the territory had been shown and had sworn their allegiance to, which claimed the Veilthorn line had held unbroken supreme authority since the founding. Someone had changed it. She did not know who. The forgery was old, not in living memory, but it had been maintained, and the original had been hidden, and someone in every generation of Veilthorn leadership had apparently known and kept the secret. Whether Darach knew, she was not certain. She had studied him. She had spent 3 years studying him more carefully than he had ever realized, and she could not determine if he was a man deceived by his own inheritance or one actively perpetuating the deception. Either answer was damaging. If the original compact were ever made public, Darach's authority would collapse, not just his political position. The packs that had sworn to him under the terms of the false compact could revoke their oaths. The Elder Council would fracture. 3 of the 5 bloodlines named in the original document still existed. They would have a claim. The Northern Territories would tear themselves apart. This was what Marina carried. This knowledge. This stone on this rope. She had carried it for over a year, and she had not known what to do with it. She had not known whether she was a wife with a weapon, or a citizen with a responsibility, or simply a woman holding something so dangerous that the smartest thing she could do was never speak of it to anyone. She still did not know. But she knew this. Darach Veilthorn did not know she had found it. And as long as he did not know, it was the one real leverage she possessed. Not for blackmail, she was not that kind of person and she knew it, but for protection. If it ever came to a moment where he had the power and the inclination to take her child away from her, to use his title and his authority and the weight of pack law to drag her back and claim the heir regardless of what she wanted. She had a weapon. She hoped she would never need to use it. She tried very hard not to think about it on ordinary days. When she was chopping vegetables in Bryn's kitchen and listening to the sounds of the village and letting herself pretend she was only Wren, a woman with a small room and a growing belly and a future that was simple and hers. On ordinary days, she almost managed it. Oren had been tracking wolves for 22 years. He had learned to do it from his mother, who had been the best tracker the Veilthorn Pack had ever produced before him, and who had taught him that the most important thing about following someone was not their footprints or their scent, or the broken stems of the plants they brushed against as they passed. The most important thing, she had said, was understanding what the person wanted, where they needed to arrive, and then working backward from there to find the path they would choose. Darach Veilthorn had given him 6 weeks. 6 weeks was, in Oren's professional opinion, too short for a woman as careful as this one appeared to be. But he had not said this, because the Alpha was not in a state where he wanted to hear professional opinions about timelines. He was in a state where he wanted his wife found, and Oren respected the distinction. Oren had spent the first 2 weeks establishing what Marina was not. She was not on the Eastern Road. She was not in any inn or boarding house within 40 miles that required a formal name. She had not sent any correspondence. She had not contacted her family. He had a discreet informant in her home village, and the family had received nothing. She had not used the network of wolf pack healers, because every pack healer in the territory reported to Valethorn ultimately, and she was careful enough to know that. What she was smart. He had found the first real trace on the 15th day. A farmer 12 miles northwest of the keep, in the foothills before the mountain ridges, who had noticed an unusual amount of disturbed mud near the barn that was not attributable to his own animals, and who, when asked the right questions in the right casual way, mentioned that there had been a strange smell around the barn on the morning of the 3rd day after the new moon. Not a human smell. The thorn moss would have degraded somewhat by then. Oren filed this away. He did not bring these findings to Darach immediately. He had learned, in years of working for strong and impatient men, that arriving with a fragment of information produced one of 2 outcomes. Either the man acted on the fragment prematurely and ruined the trail, or the man demanded daily updates that converted useful investigation into performance. Oren preferred to arrive once, with a full picture. The full picture took him 4 more weeks. When he finally came to Darach's study, on the 44th day since Marina's disappearance, he carried a single piece of paper with 4 words written on it. Darach looked at the paper, then at Oren. Darach Vast, Oren said, River Valley Settlement south-southwest. 300 people sits the boundary of 3 pack territories. None of those packs have a strong presence there. It's a place people go to stop being found. Darach looked at the paper for a long moment. She's there now. A woman named Wren arrived 7 weeks ago. She works at a place called the Greymore Rest. She fits the physical description. She paid for a visit to the village healer. The healer is human and doesn't report to anyone in cash. And, Oren paused, she has not been seen using wolf senses by any of the 3 or 4 wolves who pass through Darachvast on trading business. She's been masking consistently. She's been there 7 weeks. Darach's voice was neutral in the way of something that had been very carefully made neutral, and she's well. Oren had, in 22 years, been asked a great many things by a great many alphas, betas, and lords. He could count on one hand the number of times he had been asked, with that specific quality in a dominant wolf's voice, whether a person being tracked was well. She's well, he said. Good, Darach folded the paper. Thank you, Oren. What I need from you now is discretion, not a word of this to Lord Friedrich or the Elder Council. Already the case, Alpha. And I'll need you to come with me, not as a tracker, he paused, seeming to search for the word, a witness, someone who can confirm my behavior was appropriate if that should ever come into question. Oren thought this was an unusual thing for an Alpha King to say. He said nothing, because he was a man who had learned that saying nothing was usually the better option. He simply nodded and went to prepare for the journey. Darach rode south. He brought no armed escort, no household guard, no declaration of his rank or his intentions. He rode with Oren and 2 other men he trusted completely, all of them in plain traveling clothes, all of them on horses with no Valethorn markings. He had not told Rowena he was going. He had not told Rowena much of anything in the 7 weeks since Marina left. Rowena, who was quick and sharp and missed very little, had felt the change in him like a shift in atmospheric pressure, and had asked, once, what was happening. He had told her it was pack business. She had looked at him with those dark eyes of hers that saw everything, and she had not asked again, and somehow that had felt worse than if she had pushed. He rode south, and he thought about the receipt on the dressing table, and the sentence about names written in his wife's neat, careful handwriting, and he thought, with something that had been growing steadily in the chest over 7 weeks, and that he was only beginning to have a name for, about all the things he had said in the study that night with Friedrich that were true. She is forgettable. She is safe. She does not challenge me. He had meant all of it. He had also spent 7 weeks discovering, in the specific silence she had left behind, that a great deal of what he had called forgettable had actually been quietly essential. The negotiations with the outer settlement families that had been running smoothly for 2 years, she had managed those. He found out when they abruptly stopped running smoothly. The guard Farron had mentioned, whose daughter had needed a healer and had gone on administrative leave rather than ask the Alpha's permission. Someone had been quietly approving that leave and paying the healer's fee from the Luna's personal household account. There were 23 things Marina had been doing that no one had known to attribute to her, because she had done them in the way she apparently did everything in that house, without needing to be credited for it. He rode south with this knowledge, sitting on him like a weight he had not known was being carried for him, until it was suddenly in his own arms. It was, he was discovering, significantly heavier than it had looked. It was a market morning in Darachvast. The village had a small market on the first morning of every week. Not a large thing, nothing like the trade markets of the Pact territories, but a real one, with local farmers and a traveling cloth merchant and an old woman who sold honey from her own hives and a boy who played a stringed instrument badly, but with great enthusiasm near the well. Marina Wren had become part of the market morning routine. She and Bryn's kitchen boy, a thin 12-year-old named Perrin who was deeply earnest and almost entirely without guile, came to the market at the 7th hour to buy the week's fresh provisions. Marina carried the basket. Perrin carried the list, which he read from with the focused intensity of someone studying a sacred text. She was at the honey stall, listening to the old woman explain, at considerable length and in remarkable detail, the differences between early spring honey and late summer honey, when she felt it. Not heard, not smelled, felt. A shift in the air. The particular quality of disruption that came when something large and dominant and wolf moved into a space. Her body registered it before her mind did. Every hair on her arms lifted. Her wolf went very, very still, not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of absolute alertness. She made herself count to 3 before she turned. He was at the entrance to the market square, still in the traveling clothes, plain, dark, no markings. His hair was windswept and he had not shaved in several days. He looked nothing like the polished, contained lord of Valethorn Keep. He looked like a man who had ridden a very long way and had not slept properly, and was trying, very hard, to hold his own face in some kind of order. He had not seen her yet. Oren, 2 steps behind him, had. Oren had the grace to look at the ground. Marina did not run. She had considered what she would do in this moment. She had considered it often in the small hours of the night. Lying on her left side with one hand on her belly, and she had decided that running was not what she would do. Running would mean she was still afraid of him. And she had discovered, in 7 weeks of living as Wren, that she was not afraid of Darach Valethorn in the way she had once been. She was not afraid of his displeasure, or his disapproval, or the particular cold quality of his attention when he was disappointed in something. She had been afraid of those things for 3 years, and all of them were now nothing. He had spent all the power those fears had given him in one laugh, in one unguarded moment, in a room he thought was private. He had nothing left to frighten her with. She turned back to the honey woman and paid for a jar of late summer honey and thanked her warmly. And by the time she turned around again with her basket, Darach was 10 feet away and she could see his face clearly. He looked, was the thing of it, terrible. Not in a way that inspired pity. She had severed herself from pity for him quite deliberately, and she intended to keep it severed. But factually terrible, hollowed. The kind of tired that a wolf showed when the mate bond was disrupted, when the invisible sustaining thread that connected 2 people was gone from one side. He had felt her absence. She had not expected to feel something about that. She felt something about it. "Marina," he said. "Wren," she said. The word was quiet and completely flat. "My name here is Wren, and I would appreciate you not saying the other name loudly in a public square." He swallowed. Ren. He said it like a man learning a foreign word. Is there somewhere we can talk? There is not a great deal I want to say to you, Darach. I know that. His voice was different. That was the thing she noticed first, the thing that made her hold herself more carefully. The smooth, managed quality, the voice that always sounded like it was deciding exactly how much to reveal, was gone. What was underneath it was rougher and less certain. I know that, and I didn't come here to argue with you, or to demand things. I just need you to hear me. Around them, the market continued its ordinary morning. Perrin appeared at Marina's elbow, looked at Darach with the frank curiosity of a 12-year-old, and then looked at Marina's face and very sensibly decided to go examine the vegetable stall at the other end of the square. You have until the basket is full, Marina said. She turned and began walking toward the next stall. After a moment, he fell into step beside her. I know what you heard, he said. Yes. I know what I said. Yes. I need to, he started again. Everything I said to Friedrich that night, I said it because Friedrich is a man who respects nothing he cannot calculate the value of, and I was performing. I was being the alpha king in the way that Friedrich expected me to be, and he stopped again. She had never in 3 years heard him stop like this, unable to find the word that fit. It was strange to witness. I used you to do it. I made you smaller so that I would seem larger, and I am aware that there is no version of that which is acceptable. Marina picked up a bundle of late-season greens, inspected it, set it in the basket. If I had not heard you, she said, keeping her eyes on the vegetables, would you be saying any of this? The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. I don't know, he said, and the honesty of it was so unexpected that she looked at him. He was looking directly back at her. I want to say yes. I don't know if it's true. She looked away. The child, he said quietly, my child. My child, she said, the words arriving with a precision and a finality that were not angry but were absolute. The child I am carrying in my body, through every ache and every morning of illness and every moment of this life I have built out of nothing with my own hands, is mine. You may have a biological connection to this child. You have no claim on this child that is greater than the love I am already giving it. She felt him flinch beside her, an actual physical flinch, the kind that came from somewhere below strategy and management. She noted it without softening. I am not here to take the child from you, he said. His voice was careful, too careful, as though he was managing the urge to say something different. I am not here with guards or with a legal claim. I came alone. He exhaled. I wanted to see that you were safe. I am safe. I can see that. Another pause. You look stronger than I've seen you. I am stronger than you've seen me, she said. Because for 7 weeks I've been living as myself, and not as whatever version of me made your life simpler. They walked for a moment in silence. At the far end of the market, the boy with the stringed instrument was playing something cheerful and slightly chaotic. What is it you want? Darach asked finally. Not what you don't want, what you actually want. Tell me and I will listen. She stopped walking. She turned to face him, right there in the middle of the market square, with the honey woman and the cloth merchant and Perrin watching from the vegetable stall and the boy with the instrument playing on, and she told him. Clearly, without anger, without pleading, without any of the soft edges she had spent 3 years training into her voice. All of it, what she needed, what she would and would not accept, what the child deserved, what she deserved, the terms that were not negotiable and the ones that might become so if he proved, over time, with behavior, not with words, that he was capable of being different from what she had known. He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not manage his face. She saw things move across it, several things in sequence, and not all of them comfortable to watch, which meant they were probably real. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. All right, he said. That's not a sufficient response. No, I know. He seemed to be choosing each word individually. What I mean is, I hear you. I am not going to stand in this market and make promises I don't know yet if I can keep. You've had enough of things from me that turned out not to be what they appeared. So I'm not going to ask you to believe me. I'm asking for the opportunity to show you whether or not I mean what I say." Marina studied him. This was, she noted, nothing like any conversation she had ever had with Darach Valethorn in 3 years of marriage. She did not know what to do with that. So she filed it and kept her face even and picked up the last item on Perrin's list and told Darach he could return to the inn at the 6th hour if he wished to talk further. Then she walked away. She did not look back. But she did notice, in the quiet back room of her mind, that her hands had gone slightly unsteady while she walked, and that the unsteadiness was not fear. She filed that away too. Darach had been in Darachvast for 6 days. He had taken a room at the other inn. There were two, the Greymore Rest where Marina stayed, and a smaller, less welcoming establishment across the square where the clientele was primarily itinerant traders, and the ale was unremarkable. He and Oren and his 2 men occupied rooms there. He had not pressured Marina for further conversations. He had come to the Greymore Rest at the 6th hour of the first evening, sat in the common room, and had a cautious and somewhat stilted conversation with her over tea that had lasted an hour, and left him more aware of how much ground there was to cover between them than when he arrived. The second evening she had not come down to the common room, and he had respected that without comment. The third day he had found a different way to exist in Darachvast. He had helped Oren with a repair the innkeeper across the square needed doing, something structural with the stable door, and discovered, in the specific silence of practical physical work, something he had not felt in a very long time: the absence of an audience. No one in Darachvast knew or cared who he was. He was just a man who was reasonably useful with a hammer. He found he liked it. He had been increasingly finding things he liked that he had not known to want. On the 4th morning, Bryn, who had taken one long look at him on the first evening and drawn conclusions she had not shared, but which were visible in the precise quality of her watchfulness whenever he was near, had met him on the steps of the Greymore Rest and said, in the flat, direct way of someone who had decided they were done being careful, "She talks about the child as though it's the only real thing she's ever had. If you do anything to take that from her, you'll find that I have strong opinions about that and the ability to act on them." But he had looked at her, at this human woman with her graying hair and her innkeeper's apron and her absolute, complete, zero apologetic willingness to threaten an alpha king in front of his tracker. "I understand," he had said. She had nodded, turned, and gone back inside, and he had stood on the steps for a moment before following, thinking that this was the kind of thing Marina was, apparently, very good at finding the people who were already good and showing them that their goodness was worth using. The 4th evening, he and Marina had talked for 3 hours. It was not comfortable. Comfort between them felt like something that would have to be built slowly, from scratch, on a completely different foundation than anything they had started with. But it was real. She was honest with him in a way that she had never been during their marriage, because she had never had any reason to be. She had spent 3 years calibrating her words to the version of her that Darach's household expected, and that calibration was gone now. What was left was the actual Marina. Sharp, wry in a way he had never noticed, with opinions about everything from pack governance to the proper way to salt venison that she delivered without apology. He found her, for the first time, genuinely interesting. He found himself, for the first time, genuinely ashamed of having not noticed her before. On the morning of the 6th day, Oren found him at breakfast. Oren's face, which was typically as expressive as a piece of well-weathered stone, was doing something very controlled in the direction of concerned. "There are riders," Oren said, 8 of them, Valethorn markings, good horses, full armor. They came through the North Pass last night. They're at the ridge above the valley now." A pause. "Lord Friedrich Valethorn is with them." Darach set down his cup. "How?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Oren was too good to have been followed. which meant someone in the keep had known where Darach was going or had guessed, or... Farron, Oren said quietly. He found me before we left. I think he may have reported our destination, Alpha. I don't know his reasons. Darach did know. Farron was a loyalist. He reported to the house before he reported to Darach personally, and the house meant, in Farron's deeply conservative understanding of the world, the legitimate authority structure, which in Farron's mind included the Elder Council and Lord Friedrich. It was, Darach thought with a cold and precise kind of fury, almost elegant in its stupidity. What does Friedrich want? Oren asked. He wants the heir, Darach said, because Friedrich had wanted the Veilthorn heir for 20 years. Friedrich had no children. He had a nephew who was 17 and pliable, and who Friedrich had very clear plans for, plans that required the current Alpha King to not have a legitimate heir of his own who might complicate the succession. A child born to Darach, even a child born to a runaway Luna, was a problem for Friedrich's 20-year plan. Darach stood up. "Get Marina," he said. "Don't alarm her, but get her to the back of the Greymore Rest. Tell her that people are coming who should not know where Ren is." Oren was already moving. Darach went to the door of the inn and looked up at the ridge above the valley. The morning was clear and cold. He could not see the riders from here, but he could feel them, the particular pressure of armed wolves moving with purpose. He had brought no armor. He had brought no official escort. He had, he realized, been a different kind of fool than the one he was familiar with being. Friedrich Veilthorn arrived in Darachvast at the 9th hour, which was mid-morning and market time and deeply inconvenient for the village's ordinary functioning, because 8 armed wolves in full Veilthorn black drew attention in a settlement of 300 people in a way that could not be politely managed. He came to the Greymore Rest because someone in the village had helpfully pointed him there when he asked about strangers recently arrived. He dismounted in the courtyard with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his life in the correct clothes for every situation, and he straightened his riding gloves and looked at the inn door and then looked at Darach, who was standing in front of it. "Nephew," Friedrich said. His voice was warm in that particular way that had always reminded Darach of a fire that was slightly too hot to stand close to. "I was concerned when you left without word." "And now you found me," Darach said, "and you can leave." Friedrich tilted his head. He was 60, lean, silver-haired, with the kind of face that aged well and hid a great deal behind its handsome surface. He had always reminded Darach of the decorative knives displayed in the Veilthorn Great Hall, beautiful and primarily useful as threats. "The Elder Council has concerns," Friedrich said, coming forward. His 8 riders stayed back, but their formation shifted in a way that was not accidental. They were experienced men. They moved the way men moved when they expected things to go sideways. "The Luna has been absent from the keep for 7 weeks. There are rumors of a pregnancy. The council needs assurance that the heir to the Veilthorn seat is properly secured." "The heir," Darach said, "is secured. I am here personally." "Yes, with no guard, no documentation, and apparently no plan." Friedrich's eyes moved to the inn door as though he could see through it. "Where is she?" "She is none of your concern." Friedrich smiled. It was the kind of smile that never reached his eyes because the warmth was all on the outside. "I'm afraid she is, Darach. A Luna who has abandoned her post, carrying the pack heir in a foreign settlement that is very much the concern of the Elder Council. She should be returned to the keep. The child should be born there among the pack with the proper protections." "The proper protections," Marina said. Everyone turned. She was standing at the side entrance to the inn's courtyard, the one Darach had not thought to have covered, because she had apparently known the layout of the Greymore Rest in the last 7 weeks with the same thoroughness she had known the layout of Veilthorn Keep, and she had used the back way the same way she had used the servant's stair, by paying careful attention and by planning ahead. She was wearing her plain dark clothes. Her hair was loose. She was visibly pregnant, now 12 weeks, and the curve was no longer something that could be easily concealed. She stood in the courtyard with her arms at her sides and her face in that particular absolute stillness that Darach had first seen in the market square, and that he was beginning to understand was not passivity. It was control. The specific control of a person who has chosen exactly how much to show. Friedrich looked at her stomach, back at her face. An emotion moved across his expression, not a warm one. "Luna," he said. "Lord Friedrich," she returned. And then, with the precision of a woman who has had 12 weeks to think, "How interesting that the Elder Council sent you personally. Not a formal summons. Not a legal representative from the council chambers. You, with 8 armed men, to a human settlement with no announcement and no official documentation." Friedrich's smile didn't move. "The council acts through me in many matters." "The council has a formal written process for matters involving the Luna," Marina said. She had done this too, Darach realized. She had read the pack law, all of it. She had spent 3 years in his house, quiet and overlooked, and she had been learning everything. A formal written process that requires 3 elder signatures and a hearing at which I am represented. None of those things have happened, which means you are not here on behalf of the Elder Council. You are here on behalf of yourself. A pause perfectly timed. "Shall we discuss why?" Friedrich looked at her for a long moment. The warmth in his voice when he spoke had not moved, but something behind his eyes had. "You are cleverer than I estimated," he said. "Darach, you failed to mention." "Darach did not know," Marina said calmly. "My husband thought I was a useful, pretty, harmless girl. He said so. I imagine you agreed." Darach stood very still. He had no argument to offer. "I will not be returning to the keep under your escort," Marina continued, looking at Friedrich. "I will not be returning under anyone's escort. If and when I return to Valethorn territory, it will be on my own terms, with legal documentation of my rights and my child's rights, witnessed by representatives from at least 2 independent bloodlines. A beat. I believe I know which bloodlines have the standing to act as witnesses. The original compact was quite clear on that." Dead silence. Friedrich went very still. A different kind of stillness than Marina's. A sudden, total stillness, like an animal that has just heard something dangerous in the undergrowth. "The original compact," he repeated. "The one in the locked archive room," Marina said. "Behind the door on the left at the back of the record storage. I imagine whoever put it there expected it to stay lost." She looked at him without blinking. It did not. Oren, standing beside Darach, drew a slow, nearly inaudible breath. Darach's entire understanding of the last 12 weeks restructured itself in approximately 4 seconds. She had been carrying this. She had found this and sat with it and carried it alone for how long? He did not know, but it had been long enough for her to understand exactly what it meant and exactly when to use it. Not as a weapon, he realized, as a shield. She was not threatening to expose the forgery. She was letting Friedrich know that if anything happened to her, the information would surface. She was making herself too dangerous to simply disappear. It was, he thought, extraordinary. Friedrich looked at Darach. The warmth was entirely gone now. What was left was the sharp-edged calculation that had always been underneath it. "Your wife," Friedrich said, "is not what she appeared." "No," Darach agreed, "she isn't." And something in his voice, as he said it, was not the calculating tone of a man acknowledging a political complication. It was something else, something honest in a way that Darach's voice rarely was. Friedrich looked between them for a long, measuring moment. Then he turned and walked back to his horse. His 8 riders fell in behind him. No argument, no further words. He was a man who knew when a position had become untenable, and unlike some powerful men, he knew it quickly. The sound of hooves faded out of the courtyard. Bryn appeared in the doorway behind Marina, still holding a wooden spoon with the businesslike intensity of someone who had been listening, and was prepared to use it if necessary. Darach looked at his wife. She looked back at him. Her face was very calm, but her hands, he noticed, when he looked, were slightly unsteady. The cost of what she had just done showing up in the small private ways she could not entirely prevent. "You knew," he said, About the compact, how long? A year, she said, 14 months. He absorbed this. You carried that alone for 14 months. I didn't have anyone to carry it with, she said simply. No accusation in it, just fact. He looked at the ground for a moment, then at her face. You do now, he said, if you want that. The question hung in the cold morning air between them. Bryn's wooden spoon tapped once against the doorframe in a way that was probably not accidental. Marina said nothing for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "Come inside, I'll make tea." It was, he understood, not a declaration. It was not forgiveness. It was not a return to anything that had existed before, because what had existed before was not worth returning to. It was a door, opened by the smallest possible increment. He followed her inside. 3 months passed. The seasons turned. The valley below the mountain ridges filled up with the cold blue light of deep autumn, the leaves going amber and rust on the mountain slopes, the river running fast with early season melt from the upper snowfields. Darach did not leave. This was unexpected to everyone, including Darach. He had sent Oren and his 2 men back to the keep on the morning after Friedrich's arrival. Oren had gone without a word beyond a single long look that contained, for a man who expressed very little, quite a lot. The keep was in Farron's capable hands. The elder council had been told the Luna was resting in the eastern territories on her healer's recommendation due to the pregnancy, and the pack's daily functioning was being managed by Darach's second, a competent woman named Isolde who had been managing it mostly anyway, and who communicated with him via letter carried by a trusted courier every 5 days. He stayed. He fixed the stable door at the second inn, and then, when Bryn mentioned, in her flat, unsentimental way, that there was a section of the Greymore Rest's roof that needed attention before the heavy winter rains, he fixed that too. He negotiated on Darachvast's behalf a significantly better price from the cloth merchant who had been quietly taking advantage of the village's geographic isolation to charge above market rates. The village didn't know who he was, and he didn't tell them. He was just the man Wren seemed to know, the quiet one with the dark eyes who was useful to have around, and who, Bryn had indicated to anyone who asked, was minding his own business and they should mind theirs. With Marina, with Wren in this life, in this place, things moved slowly. She let him come to the common room in the evenings. At first they talked about practical things, the political situation in the territory, the compact and what she had found, the various machinations she had quietly observed in 3 years of overlooked listening in Valethorn Keep, and that she had never had anyone to share with. She was, he discovered with something that kept arriving in him as a kind of quiet astonishment, extraordinarily well-informed. She had spent 3 years reading everything available to her, and watching everyone around her and drawing conclusions that were, when he checked them against his own knowledge, almost uniformly correct. "You should have been the alpha," he said one evening without thinking. She looked at him across the table, a long, measuring look. "Yes," she said, "I should have been someone." The words landed cleanly. He let them. He started to learn things. Not pack things, not political things, he already knew those. He learned what she found funny, which tended toward the dry and the unexpected. He learned that she was a person who read until late into the night and then was awake and alert at dawn, which had always seemed impossible to him because he was neither. He learned that she was more patient than anyone he had ever met, but that her patience had a hard floor to it, and when you hit that floor, there was no amount of charm or authority or smooth words that would move her. He also learned, slowly and with the particular discomfort of a man discovering something about himself he had successfully avoided knowing for a long time, that the reason he had chosen Marina and spent 3 years treating her as furniture was not because she was forgettable. It was because she was the opposite. She saw things too clearly, and he had known it somewhere beneath his awareness and had been, in the most efficient way available to him, afraid of being seen. Rowena had never made him afraid, because Rowena wanted the same things he did, and reflected his own ambitions back at him with high gloss and no friction. That was not the same as being known. He wrote to Rowena. He wrote to her honestly, which was harder than he expected and took 3 drafts before he arrived at something that was true rather than managed. He told her that his choices had done damage he hadn't understood the shape of until he was standing in it, and that he didn't know what the future held, but that he knew he owed her honesty, even if it was not what either of them would prefer. He told her that she deserved someone who chose her in daylight, not in the dark compartment of a life that belonged to someone else. She wrote back 2 weeks later. Her letter was short, wry. It said that she had always known he was a coward about the things that cost him something real, and that she wished him luck figuring out what he actually wanted rather than what was convenient to want, and that she was going to the Southern Territories for a year and didn't want correspondence. He read it twice, set it in the fire, sat with what it cost him to burn it, and then got up and went to see if Marina needed help with the evening deliveries. The child announced herself more strongly as autumn deepened. Marina's pregnancy was visible now in a way that couldn't be missed. She had stopped trying to conceal it, and the village, which had drawn its own conclusions weeks ago, had simply incorporated this information into the fabric of its ordinary life, with the minimal fuss of people who minded their own business by long practice. Bryn, who had apparently decided that caring for Marina was one of her personal projects, and that this was non-negotiable, had begun making specific foods appear in the kitchen at specific times with the excuse that they needed testing. Perrin, the kitchen boy, had developed a protective instinct toward Marina that expressed itself primarily as hovering at a respectful distance and offering to carry things. And Darich found that he was, quietly and with very little drama, learning to be present. Not in the way a man with power was present, not managing, not directing, not performing, just there, asking what was needed, doing it, asking what was happening with the child, listening. He asked once if he could put his hand on her stomach. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said yes and took his hand herself and placed it carefully. The child moved. He had no language for what moved in him in response to that. It was not political. It was not a calculation about heirs and succession. It was something entirely below and before all of that. Something that lived in the part of him that the Alpha King role had buried very efficiently, and that apparently had not been entirely extinguished. "She knows you're there," Marina said, not warmly, not coldly, factually in the tone she used when she was sharing real information. He kept his hand where it was. "What do you want to name her?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Silvara," she said, "after my grandmother." "Silvara Valethorn," he said. A pause. "Or Silvara Ethwin," Marina said, using her birth name. "Depending." "Depending on what?" She looked at him with those clear eyes that had been looking at him, and seeing him clearly for 3 years before he ever noticed. "Depending on whether Silvara's father proves to be the kind of man whose name is worth giving her." He nodded. He did not argue, and he did not make promises he hadn't earned. He simply looked down at where his hand was still resting and felt the child move again, small and insistent, as though she were entirely clear about her opinions on the matter. "I will spend the rest of my life," he said very quietly, "making sure it's worth it." Marina looked at him for a long time. Then she looked out the window at the autumn valley, and she did not say anything, but her hand came to rest over his. Silvara Valethorn Ethwin was born at the 5th hour on a morning in early winter, when the valley of Darichvast was still dark, and the frost was heavy on the ground outside the Greymore Rest, and the river made a sound like low music in the distance. She was born in the small room at the top of the inn, the room with the window the size of a dinner plate that looked out at a mossy stone wall, with Bryn and old Oswin the healer in attendance and Darich in the corridor outside, because he had been placed there by Bryn with the same flat, unarguable authority she used on everyone and everything, and because he had decided quite some time ago to stop arguing about things that were not his to control. He stood in the corridor. He stood there for 4 hours and 19 minutes, in the dark and the cold, with his back against the stone wall and his hands loose at his sides, and he listened to the sounds from inside the room, and he did not move. At the 5th hour, there was a new sound. Small, high, furious. The sound of a person who has just arrived in the world and has immediate opinions about it. Derek closed his eyes. He heard Marina's voice, low and exhausted and warm in a way that was nothing like the voice she used in public, or the voice she had used with him in the early careful weeks of their conversations in the common room. It was a voice for no audience except the one she was speaking to, a voice that went into the small, private room of a brand new person and told them they were safe and loved and waited for. He sat down on the floor of the corridor with his back against the wall and put his face in his hands and stayed like that for a while. When the door opened, it was Bryn. She looked at him on the floor without visible surprise. She was not a woman who was easily surprised. "She's asking for you," Bryn said. He got up. He straightened. He took a breath, the slow kind, the kind he took before difficult meetings and hard negotiations, and then he stopped himself because this was not that. This was not something to manage. He let the breath go without managing it. He walked into the room. Marina was in the bed, propped against the pillows, pale and wrung out and more present than he had ever seen her in his life. In her arms was a very small person wrapped in a blanket that Bryn had apparently been making in secret for the past 3 weeks. The child was dark-haired. She had stopped crying and was doing something that appeared to be investigating her own fingers with extreme focus. Marina looked up at him. He was close enough now to see that her eyes were wet, not crying, not quite, but the kind of wet that came from the extreme edges of experience. He suspected his might have been doing something similar in the corridor. "Come and meet her," Marina said. He crossed the room. He sat carefully at the edge of the bed. He looked at the child, at Silvara, at this specific person who had arrived in the world with her mother's precision, and already seemed to be conducting thorough assessments of her surroundings. "Hello," he said. It was, possibly, the most inadequate thing he had ever said. He said it anyway because it was true. Silvara looked toward his voice. Her eyes were dark and unfocused in the way of newborns, but she turned her head with the precise directional accuracy of a wolf, even at this age, even this small. "She knows your voice," Marina said, the same factual tone, real information. He looked from the child to Marina. There was a great deal that remained unresolved between them. There was 3 years of a marriage built on the wrong foundations. There was the compact and the elder council and Friedrich's ambitions, and the political future of the Northern Territories, and a dozen other things that would need to be addressed carefully and probably painfully, and over a considerable amount of time. There was trust that did not yet exist in the form it needed to and would have to be built piece by piece, day by day, without shortcuts. He knew all of this. He held it clearly. And he also held the fact of this room, this morning. This woman who had been stronger than anyone around her had noticed, and this child who had arrived into the world in a small inn in a quiet valley, because her mother had refused, at enormous personal cost, in the dark, alone, to let her grow up in a beautiful cage. "I owe you more than I know how to express yet," he said, "not managed, not performed, not just an apology. I owe you the years of actually seeing you. I don't know if," he stopped, started again. "I don't know if that's something you want. I'm not asking you to decide that now. I just want you to know that I understand what the question is, finally, and I understand what it would cost if the answer was no." Marina looked at him for a long, still moment. Then she shifted Silvara carefully and held the child out to him. He took her, correctly, carefully, with the focused care of a man terrified of doing it wrong. Silvara was very warm and very solid and very real in his arms, and she made a sound of mild protest at the transition and then settled and turned her head toward him again. The mate bond, the thing that had been a dead, terrible void for months, stirred. Not restored, not healed, something more like a seed than a flower, something that would need time and warmth and all the right conditions to become what it was supposed to be, but alive. present, reaching from his side tentatively in the direction of Marina. He felt her feel it. He watched something shift very slightly across her face. "I found a house," she said, her voice quiet. "On the edge of the village. It's small. It needs work. Bryn says the family who lived there left in the spring and it's been empty." He looked at her. "I'm not going back to the keep," she said. "Not yet. Not until things are settled properly with documentation and council representation and everything done in the open." A pause. "But I thought perhaps you might want to be nearby, if you're staying." "I'm staying," he said. "Then you could fix the house," she said. And the wryness that lived in the back of her voice, the thing he had not discovered until 7 weeks into their conversations, the thing she had apparently hidden inside their marriage like a small, bright object tucked out of sight, surfaced briefly and was real and was hers. "You seem to have discovered an inclination for that." He looked down at Silvara in his arms. Outside the small window, the dark of the valley was beginning to lighten. The frost on the ground would catch it in another hour and turn silver, and the river would go from sounding like music to looking like it, and the village of Duchesses would wake up and go about its ordinary business in the way of a place that expected nothing dramatic from its mornings. "I'll start tomorrow," he said. "Good," Marina said, and she closed her eyes. Because she was exhausted and she had earned the right to rest, and she trusted, for the first time, on the basis of evidence rather than hope, that, when she opened them again, things would be as she had left them. There is an old story in the Northern Territories about a she-wolf who survived a winter alone by knowing which direction was north, even in the dark, even in the storm, even when every landmark she had relied on was buried under snow. She did not survive because someone came to rescue her. She survived because she had spent her whole life paying attention to things people told her were too small to notice, and those small things saved her when the large ones failed. Marina Ethwin was not a wolf from an old story. She was a woman who had stood outside a door and heard the truth and done the hardest thing available to her, not the dramatic thing, not the vengeful thing, but the true thing. She had chosen herself. She had chosen her child. And she had carried a secret that could have torn a territory apart and used it not as a weapon of destruction but as a shield of protection, and then placed it on the table in the open where it could be dealt with properly. That was how she dismantled a reign built on lies, not with an army, with a locked archive door and 14 months of paying attention. Darach Valethorn would spend the next 2 years earning, carefully and imperfectly, the trust he had spent 3 years not bothering to value. The Elder Council would eventually convene a full hearing on the compact, with Marina present, with legal documentation, with representatives from all 5 original bloodlines. And the outcome would be a restructured authority that was, frankly, more stable than the one it replaced. Friedrich would not attend that hearing. He would be in the outer territories by then, tending to his own affairs. Silvara would take her first steps in the house on the edge of Duchesses, the one her father had fixed with his own hands, while her mother watched from the doorway with her arms folded, and her expressions unreservedly her own. And the mate bond, that sacred, patient, moon-given thread, would mend. Not quickly, not without cost, strand by careful strand, each one requiring something real from both sides. But it would mend. Because some things that are broken can be rebuilt differently, better, truer, on foundations made of honesty rather than convenience. And sometimes the woman who disappears before dawn with nothing but her courage and her child and her very quiet, very thorough knowledge of everything going on around her is not the one who loses. She is, in the end, the one who was always meant to lead. She simply had to leave before anyone noticed she already was. If you want more unforgettable stories like this, hit subscribe, leave a like, and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload.